My name is Yuliia Ivaniuk, and I'm the coordinator of the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies at the University of Manitoba. Welcome to the discussion on Canada's cooperation with Ukraine in the defense and security sectors. I'd like to thank the co-organizer of the event, the Center for Defense and Security Studies at the University of Manitoba. And of course, I'd like to thank all of you for setting the time aside from your Pascha making to join us here today. So just a few housekeeping items before we proceed. Firstly, today's meeting will be video recorded and shared on the Center's YouTube page. And secondly, the presentations will be followed by a Q&A session. So feel free to submit your questions to the chat box, and I'll do my best to address as many of them as possible. Now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Andrea Charron, who is an associate professor at the Department of Political Studies and the director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies at the University of Manitoba. Dr. Charron has written extensively on the Arctic, NORAD, United Nations Security Council, and the Canadian Defense Policy. And today she'll provide an introduction to the topic for us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrea Charron.
Thank you so much, Yuliia. It's my absolute pleasure. I'm the director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies, and we're just thrilled to be able to partner with the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies. I think it's a really important topic today to investigate the Canadian cooperation with Ukraine in defense and security sectors. And so what I want to do is just provide a bit of context setting to set up the three wonderful speakers that we have. So I'm going to try and keep my comments very short because we really want to hear from them. One of the things you may not realize is that Canada was actually one of the first Western countries to recognize Ukraine's independence on the 2nd of December, 1991. And our relationship with Ukraine has just grown closer and closer since then. We have 1.3 million Canadian Ukrainians, many of whom live here in Winnipeg, hence the reason for the importance of the Center for Ukrainian and Canadian Studies. We benefit greatly from their culture, from the food to the dance. But we also know that at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, there is a section dedicated to the Holodomor to remember the millions who died. And Canadians join with Ukraine in remembering that terrible time in history. Canada and Ukraine have a free trade agreement that entered into force quite recently on the 1st of August, 2017. And right now, Canadian exports to Ukraine approximate $220 million a year. And we expect that only to increase in the coming future. I remember when I was working for the Canadian government in the 1990s, believe it or not, it was Ukraine that reached out to Canada and specifically our Canadian tax agency for representatives to go to Ukraine to help them set up their tax and customs systems, appropriate given today is the tax deadline. But it's really what we want to be talking about today is Op Unifier. In 2014, after the Ukrainian Revolution, Canada was fully supporting the direction that Ukraine was taking with closer relationship with the European Union. But of course, then we had Russia's aggression. And Canada quickly decided that it was important that we join the multinational joint commission. And we have had approximately 200 troops in Ukraine since September 2015 in an operation called Unifier. And you'll hear more about that. Since the COVID pandemic, the focus from training and capability and capacity increases has shifted, as you can imagine, to making sure that the troops are protected, but the work is ongoing. Just 2 weeks ago, the NATO-Ukraine Commission met in Brussels, and the NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg has again reminded Russia of the importance of the Minsk Agreement. And so we're certainly going to be watching that. The last thing I wanted to sort of raise is the importance that Ukraine has had on the UN Security Council as an elected or non-permanent member. Ukraine has served 4 times. The last time was in 2016 and 2017. As you can imagine, in a very difficult situation when Russia is a permanent member and you had the aggression ongoing in Ukraine. But despite that, it managed in those 2 years to attend 540 formal meetings and 315 informal meetings, helped to pass 130 UN resolutions and 40 presidential statements. It chaired 3 sanctions committees, and something Canada needs to note, has had 300 personnel on UN missions, far more than Canada has right now. Finally, I think one of the things that Canada and the Ukraine have in common is that on the UN Security Council, they have often tried to push the thematic resolutions that widen the aperture of the UN Security Council in terms of issues of concern for peace and security. And certainly, we're very thankful that Ukraine hosted an AREA formula meeting to look at hybrid warfare. And I think it is thanks to that meeting that opened the door to the UN Security Council considering other topics, including climate change, which is now on their agreement. So all of this to say that Ukraine and Canada have a lot of important touch points. I think it's vital that we're partners in the defense and security sectors going forward. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be part of this. And I'd now like to turn it back over to Yuliia Ivaniuk to thank her very much and to introduce our great speakers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charron, for this extremely astute introduction to the topic. And now I'd like to introduce our first distinguished panelist, His Excellency Raman Bashuk. He was an ambassador of Canada to Ukraine from 2014 to 2019. He began his career in the diplomatic service of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Canada in 1987, serving in Moscow, Kyiv, and Berlin, and various other headquarter positions. He was an ambassador in Belgrade from 2011 to 2014, with concurrent accreditation to Montenegro and Macedonia. Please welcome Ambassador Raman Bashuk.
Thank you very much, Yuliia and Dr. Charron, and thanks to those of you who have made time on a Friday afternoon, and for some, maybe it's a form of penance for Good Friday for the Julian calendar followers among you. But I'll try and make it not as painful as all that. I arrived in Kyiv in October of 2014 after having spent a week there as well in March of 2014. By November 2014, Canada was making its first major shipment of non-lethal military assistance to Ukraine. These were things like uniforms, night vision goggles, first aid equipment, that sort of thing. The Canadian Forces transport aircraft that arrived on the tarmac at Borys Airport was the first Western military aircraft to land in the Ukrainian capital since hostilities had broken out in March of 2014. So it was seen as a huge symbol of support. Everybody else was afraid to come and land. And Canada was not, and a prominent Manitoban was not. That's James Bazan, who's then Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defense, who came with that shipment, and I helped host him there in Kyiv. So that was Canadian assistance that came by air. It was a plane full. it didn't, it was more tactical than strategic, but it was hugely important in a symbolic way. Now, that was sort of one, if by air, two, if by sea. By sea in January and February of 2015, a very large Canadian shipment of equally non-lethal but essential assistance arrived. This consisted pretty much of the entire Canadian stock of Central European winter grade uniforms, which in fact have been stockpiled since the Bosnian wars, which were donated to Ukraine. There's about 30,000 plus uniforms and about 60,000 Gore-Tex boots. And for the next 5 years, when I would travel around Ukraine, I would meet veterans and soldiers who had worn those uniforms. And, you know, in the same way as Prime Minister Trudeau once said that a snowsuit is our way of saying hello to arriving Syrian refugees and saying, you're with us. For Ukrainians, those Canadian uniforms were a way of us reaching out and embracing them. An army marches on its feet, which means boots are very important. And literally, I also had the Minister of Defense tell me that they could not have called up the third wave of mobilization without that assistance from Canada. So again, you could say it's not lethal, but it was logistically key to ensuring that Ukraine could stay as a coherent fighting force in the field when active combat was still occurring. We also had considerable Canadian expat engagement in making sure the supplies actually got to the front. I had a CEO and a chief accountant from Price Waterhouse who were counting the boots as they were arriving. We had people volunteering to go to the front to make sure that the Canadian stuff actually got to the troops. So it was a kind of whole of society effort, both on the Ukrainian side, but also on the part of the Canadian presence in Ukraine. That was followed by the launch of Operation Unifier, and as Dr. Charron has mentioned, that was in September of 2015. It is now into its 12th rotation. These are 6-month rotations. Although I think the current one is actually numbered 11 because the military start with Roto 0 as the kind of initiating phase and then start numbering. It has drawn consistently on high readiness brigades from bases at Valcartier, Petawawa, and Edmonton. So I met a lot of troops from across the country, and they in turn, that was kind of the core of the task force. They in turn would bring in specialists from all across Canada, including reservists. So you saw a very wide range of uniforms and caps and Highland Regiment people and all sorts of other exotic Canadian uniforms that you would rarely see in Canada, in fact. So at about 200 people per rotation, that means that notionally up to 2,400 Canadians have participated in Op Unifier. Now, there's been some overlap. Some have been more than once. Others, in fact, post-retirement have looked to other Ukraine duties because they became so enamored of the country and of the situation there. These troops have provided a full spectrum of training, everything from the softest of assignments, from first aid training, human rights instruction, law of armed conflict, to brigade level armor exercises at the Yavoriv base. And as of September 2020, there's been the addition of a Canadian Special Forces command element, which was something that the Ukrainians have been seeking and which has now happened. That is quite a different profile from many of the other missions that are in Ukraine. And these are the partners in what is called the Quint, these are the 5 countries that provide direct military training in Ukraine. Not a terribly well-known configuration. I, in fact, got into an exchange on Twitter direct message with the defense editor of The Economist wondering, what is this Quint? I explained. He appreciated it. So the other four are the United States, which, interestingly, at least in terms of on-the-ground presence, is not the 800-pound gorilla in the field here. Its personnel presence has generally been equivalent to or smaller than the Canadian presence, between 100 and 200 personnel at the International Peace Support Center in Yavoriv. But the United States has been a massive equipment supplier and donor. Entire Coast Guard ships, Javelin missiles, etc. So they are very big on the equipping side, but more geographically limited, and I would say as well less committed to providing a consistent level of personnel to the mission. Whereas I think I'd mentioned our trainers have consistently come from high readiness brigades, reservists, reserve units, and others have cycled in and out, along with the 82nd Airborne and other crack US units. So it's kind of, there have been some ups and downs. The UK Operation Orbital is what they call their training mission. Approximately 75 personnel, but they are in constant rotations, course related. So they do quick hit courses in and out. So they train a lot, but there's not a whole lot of relationship building that can happen when you're using that modality. But they are very flexible in responding to Ukrainian Armed Forces training needs. The Lithuanians have a contingent of about 25. They are very good at updating the use of Soviet-era equipment and providing some mentoring to the Ukrainians on that, as well as the psychology of transition. How do you manage change? Because they went from a Soviet-type military to a NATO-type military. And they understand some of the psychological challenges better than Western militaries do. The Poles have trainers who come in and out, but they, on the other hand, have a sort of permanent interoperability lab in the form of Lit-Pol Ukbrig, which is military speak for Lithuanian Polish-Ukrainian Brigade. It's based in Poland, but Canada also supports it through an annual command exercise called Maple Arch. So where do I think are Canada's comparative advantages, given all of this? We actually have the biggest training boots on the ground footprint of the 5 partners, both in overall numbers, but also in geographic reach. We have had for the past several years Canadians doing training at Desna, which is a base northeast of Kyiv on the left bank of the Dnipro, in Odessa at the Academy, Shiroky Lan, a big base near Mykolaiv, Kamenets-Podilsky for demining and unexploded ordnance and IED removal. So our mission gets out more and has a better appreciation of the diversity of geography and the various missions of the Ukrainian armed forces. There's been assiduous handover work between the rotations. The commanders have been arriving months and weeks in advance, a lot of exchange of information. So they haven't just rotated in and started from scratch. They keep moving training along in terms of the goals and moving it up the value chain. Canada's is also the only military mission with a relationship with the National Guard, which is really something between a gendarmerie and a military entity. It has 60,000 personnel, which frankly makes it about the same size as the Canadian forces. And it's also more open to change than the armed forces and the Ministry of Defense. It was refounded in 2015, and I think a lot of the attachés would say that the Ukrainian armed forces don't necessarily need to go on trips to Western countries to look at what a NATO-type military could look like. They could just go down the road and see the National Guard, which have been quicker at picking up these modalities and habits, but interagency rivalries prevent them from seeing it that way. But Canada has a relationship with both, and it's the only mission that has that. Also, we have joined up thinking with the Canadian police mission, because of course, security cooperation with Ukraine also includes domestic security and policing. And our only bilateral police mission is in Ukraine. There are between 25 and 35 Canadian police officers, both from the RCMP and from municipal and provincial forces. So those two missions share resources and also work together when they work with the National Guard, which is both a kind of high-end police force and has military capacities. And we have, and this is where the Center for Defense and Security Studies and Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies synergy comes in, a cultural and spiritual empathy with the Ukrainians. That has meant Ukrainian Canadian soldiers being on pretty much every rotation. And that's included people like the former Army commander, General Paul Winnick, and Chris Reeves, who was a task force commander. And Chris Reeves is from Cape Breton. I went down to visit their pre-Christmas holiday lunch at the base in Yavoriv, and found myself sitting next to the mayor of a small town in Ternopil Oblast called Khorostkiv. And I was like, why? I mean, why are these guys from Khorostkiv here sitting next to me in the mess hall? And I asked him, I said, well, yeah, this is Chris Reeves guy, Tonash. His grandfather's from Khorostkiv. And it turned out, indeed, his grandfather had emigrated in the early 1930s with his parents to Cape Breton Island, had been a coal miner. And in fact, during the mission, they managed to set up a phone call between Khorostkiv and his grandfather back in Sydney, Nova Scotia, where they figured out where the house was that his family had emigrated from. So it's an anecdote, but that's the kind of connection that many other military forces around the world don't have. And it builds a kind of camaraderie between the trainers and trainees that works. And also I would point out that trainer and trainee is a relationship that is often flipped in this relationship, because Canadian forces, and maybe Borys will be talking more about this later, have been engaged largely in asymmetrical warfare in places like Afghanistan. And for them, working with the Ukrainians and learning from them what conventional warfare with an enemy who is as technically advanced or more advanced than you are, along a 500-kilometer stationary front, that's an experience that we haven't had in a very long time, and a lot of them find it to be very enlightening. So in terms of outcomes, there have been so far 25,000 Ukrainian soldiers trained. Now, we don't know whether all 25,000 have been retained in the armed forces of Ukraine, so that's a challenge, but certainly that's a formidable number. Canadian efforts have helped to upgrade the role of non-commissioned officers in the Ukrainian forces. They've written new curricula together with the Ukrainians for what the Ukrainians call the Sergeant Corps, which is NCOs, for the military police, and for snipers. A high level of military-to-military trust has been established, for not just because we've shown up and had credibility, but also because of the intangible factors that I've mentioned. And frankly, at this point, the Ukrainians are willing to listen to Canadians. I was witness to what had been a kind of a Western partner to Ukrainian meltdown when it came to talking command and control and the relationship between the Ministry of Defense and the Chief of Defense Staff, or the Chief of the General Staff in the Ukrainian context, where a lot of American majors had been writing memos telling the senior Ukrainians that they were to get stuffed, that they didn't understand anything, and the Ukrainians were not reacting very well to this sort of advice. On the other hand, Canada reactivated Brigadier General Craig King, put him back in uniform. He had been the guy who managed relationships between the two towers at National Defense Headquarters, the National Defense ministerial side and the Canadian Armed Forces side, and sort of on a general to general basis, he gave them many of the same points, which they then said, fine, good. It helped break the impasse, in fact, between the Ministry of Defense and the General Staff on how certain command and control issues should be dealt with. And then just an example from today's Twitter feed from the attaché and the commander in Kyiv. There's a picture of Lieutenant Colonel Melanie Lake, the Joint Task Force Ukraine commander, giving a presentation on mission command. And sitting there, listening to her, is General Waschuk, the Chief of General Staff. To me, that's a sign of how mutual respect had been built up, that, the Chief of General Staff, it will sit there and listen to a Lieutenant Colonel give a presentation. So that is, I think, a kind of visible example of the kind of relationships we built, and given the threat environment today, also the kind of additional, more strategic advisory roles that Canada might wish to consider in future. That's it.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Bashuk, for this great presentation. And now I'd like to proceed to introduce our second panelist, which is Ms. Ivanna Plakhotnyuk, who is the instructor and consultant of the Operation Unifier. And Ivanna today will provide a historical overview of Canada's military missions to Ukraine, and will discuss the cultural and sensitivity training that the Canadian Armed Forces members undergo prior to their deployment to Ukraine or other countries.
Thank you, Yuliia. And thank you for organizing this event. It will be difficult to add a lot after Raman Bashuk, but I will try from my perspective because it will be different in a few ways. First of all, I am different from other speakers today, not only because I'm a woman, which also brings a very different perspective into military training, but also because I came from Ukraine to live in Canada. I was born in Ukraine, I studied in Ukraine, I traveled a lot as a Ukrainian, and eventually my family moved to Ukraine. My background is in international affairs, and I was trained specifically in cultural analysis of the country, cultural and anthropological analysis. But I have to say that until Euromaidan, I was a very typical global young lady who thought that she was very progressivist, very pacifist, and would never be involved in something like training armed forces. But that has changed, and it completely turned over my worldview. And I think exactly that my background helped me to provide very specific and very comprehensive aspects to everything that the Canadian troops need when they are deployed to Ukraine. Well, I have to say that before that, I was also providing training to the Canadian diplomats, the similar aspects. But when the war in Ukraine started, of course, my expertise was needed also for the Canadian Armed Forces. As Mr. Waschuk already mentioned, how the Operation Unifier started, its inception was in 2015, and at first there was no clear view how exactly to train, what exactly to provide as the military training, what exactly Ukrainians need, what do they want, and where will they proceed. That crystallized a little bit later. And at first, as you know, the operation was supposed to last only for 2 years, but subsequently, because of its successes, it was extended and slightly expanded in the territory. Well, I having my parents in Ukraine and a lot of old friends in Ukraine throughout different regions with whom we used to be involved in different cultural and social projects before. I had the opportunity to check on different changes and check on different views, how people see developments in Ukraine and developments specifically in different ways of cooperation. And I think it's important to say, you slightly mentioned, Mr. Waschuk and Ms. Charron slightly mentioned about different other cooperation with Ukraine. I wanted to share, if I can find how to do it now, a slide that shows that Canadian involvement in developments in Ukraine is much bigger than just diaspora ties or the current Operation Unifier. So while you're looking on the slide, is it sharing? While you're looking on the slide, I will just tell you how progressed the perception of Canadian military personnel of the training and what were their feedback and what feedback I received on my level from the Ukrainian counterparts. It was interesting when the first training started, and I started attending them since the February 2016. I remember this first room of Canadian soldiers and their questions that they were asking that made me understand that they have been previously involved in different military operations in other regions in the world, and they already had these stereotypes. What can be happening in the country where they are going to be deployed, whether it's the inter-ethnic conflict or it's the inter-religious conflict, or that's the country where women are heavily oppressed or children are involved in the military, different problems like that. And when we started checkmarking every question like that, we suddenly realized that nothing like that was happening in Ukraine. There was no inter-religious conflict. There was no inter-ethnic war. There was nothing like something that they were bringing in their portfolio in their previous involvements in the operations. There was simply the aggression of the other country that in the past committed to actually protect the territorial integrity. To me, as a woman, it was very interesting, and I would even say that it was easy to explain how you can feel when you are attacked and you are defenseless and you have no capacity to protect yourself, and how you are abused, because we are lucky to have these aspects very well perceived and very well discussed in the Western world. We're lucky to advocate the equality for rights for women, and from that perspective, it reinforced my training. But also because I had the opportunity to travel a lot back and forth, visiting my family in Ukraine, sometimes two or three times a year. I saw how changes were happening from 2015 until now, how the country is going through so many different developments. And that was amazing. That was amazing how the army that was in almost total decay in 2014, when the aggression started, rediscovered, built its capabilities, and has now, as I recently checked, was raised to number 25 of the most capable armies in the world, which is approximately on the level of Italy. And Poland is also close in that ranking. So I think that this is a great development that also Canadians contributed to, and it's something that helps to realize how important was that hand of help that Canadians stretched to Ukraine in the most critical moment. And we know that not just Canadians, Poland was also very supportive. The stereotypes that the Canadian soldiers first had was very interesting to see how what feedback they were giving when they were returning from the rotation. How they were saying, you know, this is such a great country. We didn't even expect that we would see things like that. We thought that it was a completely underdeveloped country that is only expecting assistance from Canada, but actually in many respects, we see that it's really the equal cooperation, and we can really exchange a lot of knowledge with them on the same level. Also there are as well some problems. Not that everything is very bright, and the problems are basically related to the fact that Ukraine, having this boost after the revolution, started a lot of reforms or resumed a lot of reforms, and is going currently through 17 reforms at the same time, which needs a lot of efforts and a lot of resources. And of course, not everything can be accomplished on a very fast pace, but sometimes the general public, the wider public, is very impatient, and that creates a lot of critical attitudes and a lot of impatience and intolerance, and raises a lot of tension in the society. Some of those reforms that are very crucial for Ukraine are considered by some of the Ukrainian experts as failed reforms. But the reform of the Ukrainian armed forces is not among them. It's actually considered one of the most successful. I can say that from different feedback from people with whom I communicated in Ukraine, they see Canadian soldiers and they see the trainings with Canadian soldiers as one of the most preferable. They like Canadians for their politeness. They like Canadians for their very human approach. It's something that the Ukrainian army, having a heavy Soviet heritage, didn't experience. It's a very important novelty that Canadians bring when soldiers with the lower ranks may have a voice, may introduce their contribution. This is something that the Ukrainian army is now striving to. The problematic part of this movement is that not everybody is easily perceptive for these changes. And of course, there are personnel in the Ukrainian army that have been feeling quite well, living according to the Soviet standards, enjoying the privileges, and they don't want to have it changed. Of course, that is difficult for them. But slowly but surely, we hope that this will change and that fatigue of the reforms will not be a big obstacle, because with every rotation, new people are coming, and it's very inspiring. And it's very inspiring when there are new perspectives that are opened for the Ukrainians that are involved, that are participating in the Operation Unifier. I think that this will probably generally everything that I would contribute now. I usually rely mostly on the questions from the audience. So if there is something, I will be happy to answer later. Thank you.
And that's great. Thank you so much, Ivanna. We'll wait for questions until the end of our all of our presentations. Thank you so much for sharing your personal account of Canada's military missions to Ukraine, and of course for your unique view of conflict through the gender lens. So our next panelist today is Mr. Borys Gengalo. Once a historian at Oseratok, Borys has been an Army Reserve officer, graduate of Militia Command and Staff College, officer commanding Reconnaissance Squadron of the Fort Garry House, a senior staff officer at regional headquarters, and has held various other positions. He's now a project manager and a political analyst living in Ottawa. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Borys Gengalo.
Hi, I'm left in an invidious position as being the last one. The previous speakers have literally stolen all my thunder. So you may have seen me scrambling like mad, scribbling to try and get a few ideas together. So let's see how I do. First of all, I'll be talking about military aid to the police, and trying to wrap up a little bit about mentality, something that Ivanna, I think, touched on quite well. First of all, I think we have to realize as Canadians and Ukrainian Canadians that assistance to Ukraine is in Canada's key strategic interest. It's not just because we're nice guys. It's not just because we're Ukrainian Canadians. It's because as Canadians, it is in our interest to do so. Secondly, most aid in the security sector is not just a one-off thing done by Canadians. I think Raman described this quite well. It's done in cooperation with other allies, and it's part of a much wider effort. So let's look at the military effort. And we can divide that into two phases. The first one before 2014, the second one after 2014. Before 2014, and especially in the 1990s, and I was involved on the very margins of it, Canada and NATO had a different strategic interest. Canada and NATO, and remember these were the times of Yeltsin, wanted to integrate Russia into the Western system. So whenever we were dealing with the Ukrainians, we were told quite bluntly, don't promise Ukrainians the ability to join NATO. Don't do it. And it was said in very strict military terms. I won't repeat the language here. Then we were told, okay, maybe the Ukrainians can join NATO, but only after Russia joins NATO. However, the things we were doing, and this was quite openly acknowledged, was in a sense helping Ukrainians prepare to join NATO. The first thing we were doing, and quite a lot of it, was language training for Ukrainian officers in Canada, mostly English, but also French. English being essentially the working language within NATO. The other thing we were doing, I was involved in training the officers of the Polish-Ukrainian Peacekeeping Battalion. Now everybody talks about peacekeeping, but peacekeeping is really the ability to fight wars. And in a sense, the peacekeeping training was a way of passing on the NATO mentality and NATO methodology to Ukrainians in a different guise. Of course, 2014 comes, well, actually, even before that, when we're talking about the election of Yeltsin, the Chechen War, the Orange Revolution, the invasion of Georgia, mentality and thinking in the West changes dramatically. And in 2014, I think Raman described very well Canada's reaction and NATO's reaction to the invasion of Ukraine. So what do we do now? How do we deliver this aid to Ukraine? Well, I talked about allied cooperation. There is also, and I think Raman mentioned the Quint, there is an advisory committee to the Ministry of Defense in Ukraine, composed of a number of NATO allies, including Canada. And it does a number of things. The first principle it tries to reinforce is civilian control of the military. And here we're talking not just civilian bureaucrats, we're talking about governmental, elected government control of the military, a very important principle. It also helps the Ukrainian military develop along the lines of NATO standards. And this includes personnel, administration, logistics, overall modernization, and a key element, the role of women in the military and defense of women's interests and women's rights. And it is a little bit of a shock to Ukrainians to listen to Canadian colonels explaining the Canadian way of warfare. But it is a very important element. So that happens at the strategic level, let's say. At the tactical level, I think Raman reviewed all the elements of the training we're doing. But I would like to go back to Yavoril and talk about it a little bit more. Yavoril is a polygon or a training area between Lviv and the Polish border, where most of the tactical training is done. And here, tactics are emphasized, but there are two other elements which are very important. And that's the officer-NCO relationship, which is very different from the old Soviet military, where the officer actually did most of the jobs a sergeant or a corporal would do. And the whole idea is to try and change that so that an officer is more of an officer and relies more on an NCO. The other element is an arcane subject called battle procedure, which is the way you make your plan, deploy your troops, pass your orders on. Both these elements are very different in NATO than they were in the old Soviet military and even are now in the new Ukrainian military. And this is an actual wrenching cultural change for the Ukrainians to deal with. And I think the highlight was made about the National Guard, which seems to have adopted this much easier. A new organization starting up is willing to bring in new methods. An old organization changes very slowly and only under extreme pressure. And the Ukrainians are trying to do it. Certainly the younger elements are more accepting of it, but it is difficult for them to do. Of course, we've talked about the training across Ukraine for the various other schools. And so I think that gives us a whole impact. The whole idea here is to change the whole way the Ukrainian military and the ministry functions into a more Western-oriented, less top-down, more emphasis on individual initiative, more emphasis on elected government control. So let's have a quick look at the police. I had quite a bit of contact with the Ukrainian police in 2014 when I served as a long-term election observer. We would interview the oblast and the local police chiefs. We talked a lot with local policemen when observing the election. And I'm also working right now for the pre-deployment training for the RCMP, much like Ivanna is doing for the military, and giving them the Ukraine briefing, letting them know about the country. The police in Ukraine before 2014, and to some extent now, were considered to be one of the most corrupt agencies in the country. Not everywhere, and I've seen different opinions among Ukrainians at various levels about it, but overall it was seen as corrupt. It was seen as not serving the interests of the general population. Especially in 2014, the police themselves were feeling very put upon. Their police stations had been attacked. Some of the policemen themselves had been attacked physically, covered with manure, that sort of thing. So the whole Canadian effort is to attempt to change the police force. And we're working again at two levels. We started off, there were a couple of senior Canadian police officers, including a deputy commissioner of the RCMP who went to Ukraine, and then Raman was still there as ambassador. And they helped the Ukrainian Ministry of Internal Affairs, develop a personnel system which emphasized things like terms of reference for each position, qualifications for each position, hiring process, advertising process, and so forth. Now, this is not a perfect tool, but what it does is set the stage for eventual long-term reform of the police. And the actual reform starts with the now famous patrol police. These are the beat cops, the actual face of the police force that interacts on a daily basis with the Ukrainian population. Extremely bad reputation before 2014, but a lot of the old bottom-level police were fired. New young people who were enthusiastic about what they wanted to do as police were hired. And Canada was a major element, major force in helping train these. Like the military, the whole emphasis here is not so much on direct training, but as on mentorship. In other words, training the trainers, helping the Ukrainian trainers, the Ukrainian leaders, develop the skills necessary to bring up their juniors and develop them in the way we see proper. So the patrol police try to switch to a concept of community policing, dealing with family violence. We've trained them in things like use of force and minimizing the use of force. The emphasis again is on the role of women, both within the police and as subjects of policing, to understand what happens in family violence situations and so forth. This training is ongoing. It's taking place in various, it was training, of course, until COVID, various schools across Ukraine. The patrol police is an important engine of reform because the former Ukrainian police chief, who's now an advisor to the Minister of Internal Affairs, saw the patrol police as being the reform element moving through it. So before, you could join the police at various levels, and it was almost you were hiring your family and friends to join the police at various investigative and senior levels. Now the idea is that after 5 years in the patrol police, you're an experienced basic policeman, and you can move up the chain of command within the patrol police, but also into the other investigative units after further training. So this will slowly, over time, help the reform element within the police. Now, lastly, I was going to be talking about mentalities. Each organization has its own mentality. We see that in Canada. Foreign affairs and D&D are two different worlds. We could see that in Ukraine as well. The Ukrainian military was in the 1990s known as, along with the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as the most pro-Western elements within the Ukrainian government. And when I was there as part of the, the first formal Canadian military delegation to Ukraine, we met with some of their senior generals, and you could see they wanted to be like a NATO army. They saw NATO as professional military forces, not large draft armies. They wanted to build, they've all put their own thing. They wanted to be the head of a Ukrainian army. They didn't want to be junior brothers to a Russian army. And it was a very high degree of, professional, not so much self-confidence, but professional awareness and wanting to be professional and wanting to be part of a national army. And quite open to listening about change. As we've heard before, change isn't easy and they're not always willing to accept, but there was an openness, and they've certainly dealt very well with Canadian military personnel. I think Ivanna has talked about it a little bit. And relationships on an individual level are very good. The police were different. We've talked about the lack of community trust, their isolation from the community in many senses, the corruption throughout the police system, and especially the fact that you couldn't reform from the top. The reform started with the bottom. So there's a completely different mentality. And I think there's a war, you could call it a war within the police services in terms of reform and change. And there's a lot of resistance to it because a lot of people in the senior levels are quite satisfied with their positions and find them quite lucrative. to sort of talk a little bit about mentality. There may be two stories I can tell, and then I'll finish off because I can rattle on forever. And when we were training people at the Peacekeeping Center in the evening in the mess one time, I was talking with one of the Ukrainian officers, not from the battalion, actually, he was a staff officer from Kyiv. And he said, we really like it, the way you Canadians treat us Ukrainians. This is great, fantastic. And I was, okay, thank you very much. But aren't you exaggerating a bit? No, you have to understand. And this was in the 1990s. We go to Russia, and there we're little brothers. And nobody likes to be treated like that. We go to Brussels, NATO headquarters, and it's all very correct, all very proper, but it's just that. We go to the United States. They give us great training, but we're treated like African colonials. He used a much less polite word, but that's what. But when we come to Canada, we're treated as equals. And that to them was very important. And I think one of the key successes for Canadians, Raman hinted at that, and I think Ivanna spoke quite a bit about it. And that gives you an idea of the mentalities involved from both sides. The second story is actually not a military one, but I think is very important. I'd been facilitating a group for studying tourism in Canada. They were oblast administrators and some people from the ministry in Kyiv. And we went to a briefing on regional tourism in St. Catharines for the Niagara region. I mean, it was well prepared, but it was almost death by PowerPoint. 2.5 hours, and I was quite literally stabbing myself with my pen to stay awake during it. But a lot of good information, but a bit overmuch and no coffee break. So at the end of it, the local people were thanked. We were walking away, and as usual, I asked the Ukrainians, well, what did you think of this? And I had my expectations of what they say. And they were, it was fantastic. And I was sort of, is this the same briefing I was in? So I had to ask, why? What was so good? Well, they told us about their mistakes. And that was a sort of eye-opener for me. Of course, in Ukraine, well, here as well, but very specifically in Ukraine, you never admit a mistake. Everything is always correct. Everything is always good. And here, the Canadians, they trusted us so much that they admitted their mistakes to us, and we learned from them. And I think that captures a bit of the mentality from both sides. And a couple of the reasons why Canadians have been so successful in dealing with Ukraine and Ukrainian military and police forces. I think, again, I would suggest there are some questions you guys might want to ask. Why is it in Canada's strategic interest? Not just Canadian government aid, but community aid to Ukraine, which is quite an important factor. And of course, the role of Ukrainian Canadians in all of this within the government sector. And on that point, I think I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Borys, for your detailed analysis of the reforms that were conducted in Ukraine in the defense and law enforcement sectors, and also for comparing the different mentalities, which can clearly be both a barrier and an impetus for change and development. And thank you so much to all of our panelists today for your presentations. It's certainly really exciting to see what future holds for all of us. And now I'd like to open the floor for discussion. So the first question that I'd like to be addressed is the following. Ukraine has a long-standing history of relationships with NATO, and Henry Kissinger believes that Ukraine should maintain a non-aligned or neutral status and sort of serve as the meeting ground for East and West. What is your take on this? So it's not addressed to any particular person. So if one of you would like to tackle this one, that would be awesome. Ambassador Bashuk, yes, please.
Being non-aligned in 2014 allowed Ukraine to become a meeting ground for Russian tanks coming into its territory. So Dr. Kissinger is a very distinguished individual, but being consigned to buffer status is somewhat uncomfortable if you are the actual buffer. If you're kind of the bumper cars smashing into it, it's kind of okay. But if you're at the actual buffer, not so great. I appreciate the fact that there is no consensus currently within the alliance to act on the 2008 Bucharest sort of quasi-commitment to allow Georgia and Ukraine to join. So it's not going to happen in the next year or two. I think the Ukrainians have amped up the advocacy, but I don't think it's going to actually work in the short term. But through the various programs that we've been supporting and others, Ukraine has become more interoperable. They are now an enhanced opportunity partner of the alliance. They've been part of NATO-led missions in other countries. So there's now, I think it's an iterative process of growing closer in the same way as Ukraine has an association agreement with the EU, has been adopting a whole range of EU legislation, is not yet formally a candidate for EU membership, but I think in the next 10 years, we'll see that will change. I actually think Ukraine has a greater chance of receiving a green light for some prospect of EU membership than for NATO. The move to NATO might come more quickly when it does, but I think it'll be a longer time coming, just given that people don't necessarily, even fans of the open door, like Canada, aren't always comfortable with the idea of joining into an existing open conflict. So I think being able to see the nuances, being able to see degrees of incrementalism in Ukraine growing closer to NATO, and again, you see it in terms of the Americans, you see it in terms of them having shipped globe masters full of equipment into Ukraine in the past month. That's not NATO membership, but it's maybe of more practical importance to the Ukrainians and to just deterring the Russians in the here and now.
Thank you so much, Pan Raman, and also your answer kind of like flows perfectly into the next question that Marko Levetsky has asked. So he's, I think this is one of those questions that all of us have been wondering, given the recent current events. So there has been a lot of speculation over Putin's buildup of Russian forces nearby Ukrainian border and subsequent withdrawal. Some say he blinked, others say that he perhaps has gotten what he wanted. What is your take on this situation? So
am I allowed to do the classic diplomatic thing, like he both blinked and got some of what he wanted? I think that what's interesting is the way the Russians have themselves chosen to portray it after the initial ramp-up phase was over. There was an article that appeared right after they announced that they would start withdrawing troops by former President Medvedev, comparing what had happened in April to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, and where he said, this is all about gaining respect. It's also about brinkmanship, though, as was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Were they willing to grab some territory, maybe around the canal, or were they maybe possibly thinking of recognizing the illegitimate separatist entities, or maybe introducing some troops as peacekeepers? Possibly. I think they got enough signals, on the one hand, from the Biden administration that bad things might happen to their bank accounts or other sectors of their economy if they chose to do that, but also the carrot of a summit meeting, which plays to the Putin and the Russian obsession with, we are the other great power. You can call us an economy the size of Portugal, but we are nuclear armed, we are scary, you got to take us seriously. So I think they've gained in self-esteem, but they've had to step back in terms of some of the territorial or other ambitions they may have had.
I would look at it from a different context. I think The diplomatic and political one is certainly very important, but we can also look at it from a military point of view. First of all, the military practices and trains for everything. So this was one massive practice or training exercise to prepare for the invasion of Ukraine. They're going to sit back and they're going to do their lessons learned, figure out what their mistakes were, try and correct them for next time around. One element. Second element, they already had two major semi-permanent camps, one in Kursk Oblast, another one in Bryansk Oblast, sitting on the Ukrainian border, Bryansk touching both Belarus and Ukraine. Now they've managed to put together a third one in Voronezh Oblast, backing up to one in Kursk and sitting just north of Kharkiv. So they've developed their military infrastructure on the Ukrainian border. And thirdly, and this is uncertain, but some of the media coverage seems to suggest, or state outright, that they've left a lot of their equipment in place that they moved in. And this is very important. Logistically, moving thousands of pieces of equipment is very difficult. I was trains officer for my squadron in Germany, and believe me, it is no easy task to move 40, 50, 60, 80 armored vehicles, all their ancillary equipment. Never mind the tens of thousands necessary for a full invasion force. So it's a lot easier to get a few airplanes and move the people in than it is to move all the equipment in. So both from a learning point of view, from an infrastructure point of view, and from an equipment in place point of view, they're in a much better position next time around. And the warning time for Ukraine as a result will be a lot shorter than it was this time if they actually decide to do something.
Thank you so much to both of you, Pan Raman and Pan Borys, for the military and for the diplomatic views on this topic. And the next question is from Mr. Malik. He's curious to find out more about the recent police reform. He believes it to be a failed effort. And it would be great if one of you could address what could have been done differently and whether Ukraine should start the police reform from scratch.
Could I maybe start from the back of that sentence question? The answer is no. And then move back to the beginning. I don't accept the kind of Manichaean Ukrainian civil society view that if everything has not changed and become amazing, then it's a total failure. This is one of the, for those of you who have subjected yourselves to my YouTube talk on issues with Western support to Ukraine, this is one of these things where, if we haven't achieved 105%, it's a failure. Let's burn it all down. I had a Canadian, I think it's judicial trainer, said, "Why can't Ukrainians live with 80% success?" This is now part of the reason is they've been hoodwinked by people claiming to have 80% success and discovered that things have been rolled back. And we keep experiencing that too. But I would say that, for example, the fact that the new recruits into the Ukrainian police were and still are about 29% women, that's a systemic change. The fact that there are now dedicated units devoted to domestic violence, which bring together psychologists and police officers to help address things called Polina, that's a systemic change. Are there still corrupt investigators? Do people still get beat up sometimes? Yes. I would say that those who have successfully completed nationwide police reform in the US should come and fix it immediately in Ukraine.
This is horrible, but I actually agree with Roman.
No.
This up. First of all, we have to realize that, I'm sorry, Ukraine is starting from scratch. That's what the patrol police is about. There is a whole new force, including some members of the old police, but mostly it's a new force being built up that faces the people. This is the force that hopefully will eventually, the personnel from it will eventually soak up through the system. That's what a lot of our effort was about in terms of developing the personnel and the administrative system. Is it perfect? No. The patrol police are having their problems, and some of them are quitting. They're frustrated. They were promised more pay, I think, than they actually got, or they feel they were. When some of them bring criminal charges or ask to bring criminal charges, their superiors veto it. Obvious reasons. So these problems do exist in many cases. But you start, you build, and you keep fighting. And the Ukrainians are doing that. And certainly the Canadian policemen that go over there are impressed with what they see and like it. And I've known at least 2 that want to go back to Ukraine and teach more. So there is success happening. But, you know, when I was talking about the military, I talked about cultural change. Well, it's the same thing with the police. This is hard. I have seen it in business in Canada. It is hard to change culture, folks. Think of what you're doing. Think if you're a Ukrainian Canadian Orthodox priest. Tomorrow, you're running a United Church parish. You'd be standing on your head. Your head would explode. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about a completely different way of thinking and acting. And it is very difficult to change mentalities and change behavior. It takes time. And you have to keep plugging away. You'll have losses. You'll have wins. But you can't stop. Sorry.
Thank you so much for this positive outlook on the situation and on the reforms in Ukraine. It's definitely good to hear. Our next question is directed to Ambassador Waschuk and Dr. Charron. So whichever of you would like to tackle this one, that would be great. So there have been some talks by the Ukrainian government about their desire to restore Ukraine's nuclear status as a nuclear power. All of us know that in 1991, Ukraine inherited the world's third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons, which eventually they decided to give up in 1996 due to a whole range of factors. So now some of the Ukrainian politicians are once again talking about about this issue and about whether it was right and about whether it should be restored at this point. So what do you think of these talks and such ideas, and would Canadian government potentially support such actions by Ukraine?
Ambassador, do you want to start?
That's a hard one to tackle.
Again, I'll start from the last question and again just say no. The Canadian government would not support this. But also, this is not a serious proposal for a couple of reasons. One, this came from a frustrated, actually, Ukrainian ambassador in Berlin who said, "You Germans, you don't take us seriously. You know, if you keep hanging us out to dry, maybe we'll just have to get our nuclear weapons again." And he was dumped all over in the Ukrainian media and social media, saying like this guy's way out of line. Somebody said maybe we should show the ability to organize vaccination before we actually threaten the world with restarting a nuclear weapons program. So it's not realistic, and it is not something that anyone with direct access to decision-making in Ukraine is actively considering. It's the sort of thing Ukrainians say when they feel really frustrated and say, "Oh, you know, we could have been a contender," but it's not in the cards. I don't know. Dr. Charron may have a different view here. But.
No, I would agree. I think there's always been this erroneous sort of calculus that nuclear weapons equals respect on the world stage. And I think we've progressed enough in terms of international regimes and international law that many of us see what a fallacy that this is. And that especially at a time when we're seeing worldwide arms exports are increasing, this is something we really have to rail against, because the number of both conventional and weapons of mass destruction that are now a shortcut for the hard work of diplomacy and working on things like clean energy, this trade-off that, you know, if we can develop nuclear weapons, oh, by the way, we promise that we'll also work towards a greener economy. All of this is, we have to call a spade a spade. This is all fallacious arguments, and it will not improve security and stability in the region if Ukraine decides to have nuclear weapons.
Thank you so much to both of you for tackling this extremely not easy question, extremely difficult question. So the next question that we received is from Dennis Wolko. He's sending greetings to everyone, and he's directing his question in particular to Pan Bashuk, and he's asking what are the most important lessons, what the most important lessons are that you've learned during your time in Ukraine as far as bilateral cooperation is concerned.
Well, yeah, bilateral, I would say, in fact, that both Operation Unifier and the police mission are two examples of doing things right, which is that you have a large cadre of people, especially, and then within that, a leadership cadre that spends a lot of time getting to know the system they're working with as partners, and thus being able to target the Canadian effort towards the parts of the institution that are willing to change and willing to adopt change. So that applies to Canada going where others wouldn't, which is to the National Guard, because we saw that they are ready to quickly act on stuff we might have to share with them. It also means choosing the military training institutions where we've decided to go because of, you know, who's in charge, because of maybe there's a subsection there led by an innovative person in terms of training. But you only know that if you've been there long enough to have understood your operating environment. What you don't want is this kind of flyby PowerPoint sort of presentation to people saying, hi, we're here to tell you a lot of stuff, we're out of here. And then the next bunch of people come in. So that's ironically, alas, what some of the multilaterals have been financing. But I'd say the Canadian bilateral efforts have been effective because of us knowing the operating environment and building the trust with the partners.
Thank you so much. And it flows a little bit into our next question from Ostap Havalashka, who is drawing on his own experience in Ukraine, mentioning that Ukraine has an enormous potential both in science and technology, and he'd be curious to find out more about the potential two-way street cooperation between Canada and Ukraine, and how Canada can use Ukraine's know-how in military, space, and technology areas to its own and mutual benefit. I think quite often when we talk about cooperation, Ukraine tends to benefit slightly more than Canada when we talk about a lot of these mutual agreements. So in this one, I think Pan Ostap would like to find out more about how Canada could benefit more from these types of connections. And he doesn't mention who this question is directed to, so perhaps Pan Bashuk once again would like to tackle it, or anyone else if they would like to contribute as well. Very, very welcome to contribute.
I don't know, maybe Ivanka's noticed something from her interactions with troops.
Well, I can only say in general words that this cooperation definitely is prospective between Canada and Ukraine, because Canada has pulled out from the cooperation with Russia in aerospace technologies, as far as I know, and Ukraine is one of the replacements, given that Ukraine has a great potential developments in Dnipro, in the city of Dnipro, that has always been a Ukrainian let's say, the center of Ukrainian aerospace technology and aerospace intellectual potential. So yes, definitely there are perspectives, and I know that there were talks about that during the reform conference that took place in Toronto 2 years ago. Or is it 2 years ago? Yes. But maybe other speakers have more details to contribute on that topic.
Yeah,
I think I would. Oh, go ahead, Raman.
No, Borys, go ahead.
Just a couple of quick things. I think I'd like to underline something that Ivanna mentioned earlier in her presentation. Canadian soldiers are learning from Ukrainian soldiers about how to behave on a modern mid-intensity battlefield. Drones, electronic warfare, and so forth. We haven't had to deal with that sort of battlefield since we prepared to fight the Soviets in Germany in the 1970s and 80s. So we're learning new lessons and relearning old ones. And it is a two-way street at places like Yavori and when senior officers meet. I think there has been some tech cooperation. There are Canadian tech firms, especially programming firms and computerization firms that have operations in Ukraine that hire Ukrainian specialists. There was even a group that bought a Ukrainian tech firm, I think from Lviv, computer firm, and moved them lock, stock, and barrel, including personnel. I believe it was to Moncton, New Brunswick. So there is cooperation at the business level. There could be a lot more. Ukraine right now, as I understand it, has the largest number of independent programmers in Europe. There are 99,000 of them. These are people who are working on their own, not locked up in larger operations. And larger American operations, whether it's Facebook, Microsoft, or whatever, have operations in Ukraine doing programming for them of hundreds and indeed of thousands of people. So there's a strong potential. I think the one, in dealing with Canadian business, the one weakness is Canadian business is strongly focused on the US. It's an easy market to deal with. And there are a lot of exceptions to this, but Canadian businessmen are lazy when it comes to working outside their normal frame of reference, to be blunt about it.
If I just sort of follow up on that, yes, our main problem was not finding Ukrainian customers for Canadian stuff, but Canadians willing to invest time to export to Ukraine.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a strange problem to have. But there's another angle here, which relates to, let's say, innovation. Ukraine, because of the very haphazard nature of the way it responded to the conflict and a kind of crowdsourced nature, came up with solutions that were actually quite technologically advanced, but hadn't gone through a kind of formal standard military procurement practice. And so we would bring in Canadian officers to the Ukrainian C4 ISR unit at Rozvidka, and they, what you see is 6, 7, 8 layer information gathering from the front line, using largely off the rack programming components, tweaked, cameras have been installed along the entire 500-kilometer front. In many cases, they'd say, actually, what you've built here, what you've improvised here, is what we're promised that we'll get in 5 years from now, after the procurement process we began 15 years ago. So one of the problems is that Ukraine has solutions that we can't have because they're too flexible and don't fit in the juggernaut nature of the Canadian military public procurement process. So, we talk about culture change and issues. Military procurement is kind of the Ukrainian police reform of our security sector. It's a culture that you can't shift, and there are so many interests involved that you just can't do it. But there was this kind of almost envy of the way that the Ukrainians were able to put systems together without all of the governance systems that are supposed to ensure security and transparency, but also to some extent shackle innovation in our own defense establishment.
Thank you so much for this great analysis. And our next question comes from Michael Zayats. He is curious to find out more about the difficulties and successes that women face in their various roles in the Ukrainian armed forces. And just to speak to that, about 11% of military personnel in Ukraine are women. However, female representation in the upper ranks is quite minimal, I'd say. What policies or practices would you recommend to Ukraine to improve gender equality in this area? Perhaps Ivanna would like to talk to about this.
Yeah, I would like to provide some clearness to that question. First of all, we know that Ukraine comes with the heavy Soviet heritage, as I said earlier, and that included attitudes toward women and women's rights, including women's presence in the military. When we are talking about different changes and different reforms and how things are changing now or not changing, but we want them to be very different, it doesn't mean that everything was completely different before the reforms started. It doesn't mean that women didn't have rights or they were not present in the in different security forces. It means that there were different nuances that became visible only thanks to this war, including to what extent women were protected, I'm saying in the quotation marks, by the Soviet laws. That means that women were prevented to apply to about 300 different professions. And this was a significant obstacle for women to become fully recognized participants of the current ongoing war and to receive the same, well, obviously, they were not fighting for the benefits, but at some point of life, people need these benefits from the country to receive the same benefits as men. That I will give a very straightforward example. For example, women were participating, and here I'm talking mostly about the volunteer battalions, the volunteer forces that were one of the biggest forces to stop the aggression at the early stages of the war that changed the situation at the front line significantly. So women who participated in these battles, they volunteered, they participated, they contributed, they sacrificed their lives sometimes, they sacrificed their comfort of the family life, without even knowing what was going on with the documents. When they returned to the civil life, it turned out that they were recorded as, for example, just cleaners or cooks or seamstrippers or anything that is just, like supporting personnel, but not the real military position that they were taking and that they were fulfilling, sometimes even leading some groups. And it turned out that this was done not because someone wanted to hurt these women, but because the laws that Ukraine inherited from the Soviet system, very sophisticated system that prescribed every single step for every person in their life. This system just had laws that prevented women to serve in the military combat positions. So what happened? A very big breakthrough happened actually over the past, I would say, 4 or 5 years now. 4 years, 3-4 years. There was it first started from the academic research, and I want to make immediately a comparison to the Canadian approach, to this question in the Canadian military, how it started, because it also started with the academic research. The academic research that later developed into a big cultural project, a big information project that eventually encompassed also the parliamentary lobby groups that included the members of the parliament who advocated to change this situation from various parties. That led to the votes in the Parliament of Ukraine in 2018 that adopted the law that abolished these bans on the professions for women, and that let women proceed in their military or other security careers to the higher ranks. So far, we do not have many of women on the higher positions, but we still have them. We still have a very educated, very apt women in very high positions in these sectors. And we have right now the open doors for women to study for this career, to proceed this career. Of course, there are some problems. It never comes without problems. It's never very bright as in fairy tale, as we know. But still, I consider this to be a very great breakthrough. And again, speaking back to the Canadian experience, and I think Dr. Charron can expand on that, I know that it took about a few decades to move that process, while in Ukraine, it just took a few years. So I think when Ukrainians are complaining about not having any progress, they should just look on the experience of other countries, of the successful countries, where these steps are taking decades, sometimes 20 years, sometimes 30 years. The Ukrainian women were able to move this stone in 5 years only.
Thank you, Ivanna, for ending on such a positive note. And we have time for one last question. So I'm just going to combine a few of them that we have left. So firstly, Stevko Bandera is curious to find out more about Crimea's access to fresh water as a factor in potential conflict and future aggression on the Russian side. And also, just to add to that, we all know that Russians used Ukraine as a testing ground, not only for new weapons and military tactics, but also for disinformation and weaponization of the internet. How does it impact the West, and what can we here in the West learn from this situation? Whoever would like to tackle this one?
I'll take a stab. On the freshwater situation, I'm not a hydrologist, but my understanding is that there is enough water for most municipal and household use in Crimea, but not for the large-scale irrigation agriculture that had been installed in Crimea based on the canal. So people aren't going to go without their cup of tea because the canal is closed, but the Russians aren't going to be able to use 80% of the of Crimea's agricultural land in the way that that they would have hoped to. So whether that's still enough of a motivation for them to go and to go for the canal or not, and if they are, then they're not going to say, you know, we want to grow more potatoes and watermelons. They're going to say, oh, the poor people in Yalta have no water to drink, even though that is not actually the case. It's the balance of use. So that's my attempt at that question.
If I may add a few words to that.
Of course, go ahead, please.
So I will speak not from myself. I will speak from Mr. Mustafa Jamilov, I was very privileged to accompany him on his trips to Canada a few times, including on the day when Canadian Parliament was voting on recognizing the deportation of Crimean Tatars as the genocide. We should not forget that Crimea Peninsula is the native land of a very important minority in Ukraine, that is the indigenous nation of Crimea, Crimean Tatars. And it is very important to listen to their voice, what they think about what should happen to Crimea and what policies should be applied to Crimea. So Mr. Mustafa Jamilov always stressed that if depriving Crimea of water will help to kick out Russian forces from there, we will all try to do whatever is possible to do that. Even if all our land will become completely dry, if this is the way to proceed, all Crimean Tatar community will support that decision. So I think this is something that should be considered.
Perhaps I could tackle the hybrid warfare part of the question.
Yes, please.
Some people are really going to get irritated, especially the Canadians. The Ukrainians will love this. Sorry, folks. Russia has been at war with the West writ large for the past 15, maybe even more years. And you just have to look at it. Across the full spectrum of warfare, and that's what hybrid warfare is. It's using everything in addition to military and including military force. We'll go through some of the things. A whole range of assassinations in Great Britain. Tens of millions of euros given to the Front National in France. The use of a member of the Bundestag to hire Polish right-wingers to commit a crime against Hungarians in Zakarpattia pretending to be Ukrainian nationalists. Never mind the interference in the American election, in Brexit. The maintenance of military forces in the Transnistrian Republic, the invasion of Georgia, the blowing up of military munition stores in Czechoslovakia, and on and on and on, and bloody hell on. They are fighting a war against us. We just don't realize it yet. The question is, how do you deal with it? And I think to a large extent, we have to think of this as a long-term war. So we can't play whack-a-mole. It's not just enough to challenge each lie, although that's important, and fight it. You have to sit back and you have to prepare your own population for it. And you have to prepare people to analyze what's going on around them. They actually did that in Ukraine. I think there was a Swedish group sponsored a project with Ukrainian students to prove them against lies on the internet. And their ability to recognize that went from 20 to 60% after a few months of simple education. We have to do that with our own communities, which will help us prepare not only against external threats like Russia, but also internal threats. And it's a matter of preparing ourselves and understanding what's going on around us. I'm not suggesting we launch a war against Russia. The best form of dealing with this is a very adequate defense that literally takes away the effectiveness of their weapons. And it's hard to do, and it takes a long time. But in the long run, it can be effective.
Thank you so much for these very astute comments, and thank you so much to our distinguished speakers for the great analysis and for the great discussion that we had today, and to all of our guests who have agreed to spend their Friday night with us before Easter. And happy Easter to those who will be celebrating on Sunday, and looking forward to seeing you at our next events. Дякую за увагу.
If I may just say one last word.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Since we were discussing here the Operation Unifier, I encourage everyone to follow the Operation Unifier accounts in the social media. They are present everywhere, and you will be able to find out all the news about what is going on with Canadians in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Дякую за увагу. To everyone.
Дякую. Приємно було.
Дуже приємно. До побачення.